work session to order. And then I think we can keep the conversation fairly brief. I think well, never mind. We'll talk. I'm getting ahead of myself now, so apologize for that. At this time, it is 6:04 p.m. and I call this City Council work session of January 24th, 2023 to order. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Luna-Leal.
Here.
Councilmember Hill.
Present.
Councilmember Wilson is absent. Councilmember Grant is absent. Councilmember Porchenzi is absent, and Councilmember Green is absent. Mayor?
I'm present. Okay. We don't have much of an agenda and we're not going to go through an approval process. Are there any housekeeping matters that anybody would like to discuss briefly before we get rolling? Okay, thank you. Is there anybody in the public who would like to make comments on items that are not on this agenda? If so, please let us know. Come up, introduce yourself, and you'll have 3 minutes.
Where should I speak from?
And you can have a speaker here as well.
Cisco Tharp, 315 Chestnut. Hi, everybody. Just here to say thanks for the great job clearing snow this winter. It's been awesome on my street. Seems like the other streets have been good. And I know it's a big job, so thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We always love hearing it. We just had a meeting with Tony Medina, the streets department supervisor today, and he has received good feedback on the streets. So I will pass this additional good feedback along.
Nice.
Thank you so much for making
The driver even like kind of swerved into my driveway and like got a big old swath of my driveway, which was awesome.
That's great.
They want more snow.
Yeah, these 2-inch, 3-inch storms aren't really like, super excited. But anyway, just want to pass that on and
Thank you.
good luck tonight. Hope you have a good conversation. I won't join you for it, but thanks for doing it.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Cisco. Good to
Cisco.
see you.
Councilmember Green is joined.
Mr.
Okay,
Mayor, would
anybody
you-
else? I'm sorry. Anybody else in the public who'd like to make comments on items not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the conversation, which is the National Historic Landmark District code amendments. I mean, we've heard some of this stuff several times before. Do you have any thoughts, Chapin, going into this conversation and subsequent conversations?
Well, Mr. Mayor, we have 2 council members who are here tonight, who are not at the joint work session back in December. So I guess I would just kind of like to ask those council members kind of to what level of detail they would like my presentation, because I'm prepared to kind of just take it from the top and recap a lot of the things that we discussed at the joint work session. But if those council members, have read the memo in detail, I can kind of just jump straight to the main point. So really, however we think that should best go, I don't want to waste anybody's time.
Well, for what it's worth, I have not read the memo thoroughly, so
Okay, take it from the top.
I'd be okay with that.
Okay, would that be all right with you, Councilmember Green, if I take it from the top?
Yes, of course.
Okay, awesome. All right, and then just as I'm kind of just beginning the presentation, would you mind just pulling up the packet, because there will be a few images just throughout the presentation I'd like to just refer to. You don't necessarily have to do it right now to share the screen, but if you want to just pull that up, so at some point we can look at that. Thank you, Hannah. All right, so as most of you are aware, we had a joint work session with the Historic Preservation Commission and the council back in December. And so we are reconvening without the Historic Preservation Commission, but we do have Joey Edwards here, member of the HPC, to kind of represent the HPC. But this is, again, a focused work session with just the council members. So the purpose of this is to really get some feedback on some of these items that the Historic Preservation Commission and staff is supportive of and find that is necessary, these code amendments that are essentially to protect the character of the historic district. Just to provide some background on kind of how we got here today, the HPC did bring forth a draft of an ordinance that would address a demolition concern that the HPC and staff has. And at that time, we did not have a consensus of the council. There was further discussion needed. And so the council did enact a 6-month, it's a 10-month moratorium for demolition in the historic district. And that moratorium went into effect a few weeks ago. And share my screen? Yeah. Oh, okay. Okay. I can share my screen. We can plug in if maybe you guys. And then, so that moratorium is in effect right now. When the council initially last discussed the demolition concern, it was decided that there were some other amendments that the HPC has been working on, and so the council provided direction. They'd like to see all of those amendments kind of in context all together at the same time. So the city attorney has prepared a red line version of the code of amendments that both she and staff and the HPC are recommending. Those are included in the work session packet tonight, in addition to my memo. So that's just want to provide some background on how we got here. I also felt that it was important to provide some background information just on historic preservation in Leadville in general. And that really starts with our comprehensive plan, which was last updated in 2015. And that document really is the overall guiding document that really establishes a set of values for all the things that we want to accomplish. So it's, I'll credit Lori Simonson, she used a good term. It's the Constitution that really establishes a framework, and then it's the things like our zoning code that actually provides the regulation. The comprehensive plan does make numerous references to historic preservation, and it talks about how historic preservation is essential in Leadville. And it goes into things like the relationship between historic preservation and economic development. And I provide an exhibit in your memo. It's on page 6 of that. It's just a one page appendix exhibit that highlights not all, but some of these references to the value and importance of historic preservation in the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan is an established document that goes through a lot of public input. It's a statutory requirement. So it really gives us a good starting point to talk about how do we value historic preservation in Leadville. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I would encourage you to do that. It does, I'll just kind of highlight a few references that it makes. I won't read the whole thing because it is included in your packet, but it talks about protecting the charm and character of Leadville, and things like encouraging appropriate and sensitive redevelopment and infill. There's several other references that just encourage you to take a look at that. But that is kind of how we get started with historic preservation in Leadville. Moving on, so we have, of course, a National Historic Landmark District. So this is really a special designation. So designation was established in 1961 by the National Park Service. We are one of 26 National Historic Landmarks in Colorado. So other examples of designations that are on par with that would be the Red Rocks, the U.S. Air Force Academy, for a few examples. We're also one of 6 cities in the state to hold a National Historic Landmark status. So, for example, the U.S. Air Force Academy is not within inside a city, so we're just one of 6 cities in the state to have that district designation. The original designation in 1961 was based upon certain unique characteristics of Leadville that we continue to have today. So I'll quote from that original 1961 document, but I'll paraphrase here, but distinctive and important historic buildings supported by anonymous dwellings and business establishments that is essentially establishing this overall central architectural theme. So in other words, it's not just the Tabor Opera House that gives us our designation. It is buildings like the Tabor Opera House and other buildings throughout town that are supported by these other, and the word is anonymous, these anonymous dwellings, so buildings that we all would not know by name, but combined together, these hundreds of buildings provide this overall character and this overall central architectural theme that is essential that was essential and is essential to the designation of our district. So we do have adopted code regulations that help place some protections for the district so that character is maintained. And there's an intent statement in the code, but essentially, just to summarize that intent statement for the regulations that we do have right now in the code already, things like protecting the character of town, safeguarding cultural, historic heritages. And there's a long list that's included on page 2 of your memo. So we do have some regulations in place to protect this district. We're also a certified local government. We have that designation. So the acronym is CLG, but this is a designation that's provided directly from the State Office of Historic Preservation and the National Park Service. That was original designation was in 2013, so a decade now. We're one of 67 CLGs in the state, and that certification allows us to participate in what's called the National Preservation Program. So we can essentially administer our district consistent with the National Historic Preservation Act and the Secretary of Interior standards for historic preservation. Some of the benefits of having that designation include we can receive grant money from the state. In fact, right now we've applied to the state for a grant to go out and survey an area, one of the areas of our district that we need to survey in the northern part of town, so we can understand how these we can understand more about these individual buildings. And that's a process, a multi-year process, and we're just in phase 2 of a multi-phase process. And then we have a Historic Preservation Commission, which is required as part of this CLG designation. The Historic Preservation Commission functions just like the Planning and Zoning Commission in that it is an appointed body by the City Council. It is an advisory body, so that means that, of course, it makes recommendations just like Planning and Zoning Commission to the City Council. City Council being the ultimate deciding body on applications for development of properties. We have 2 guideline documents that have been adopted previously that the Historic Preservation Commission and staff uses to review development applications. So right now we have the Harrison District Design Guidelines, and those were established in 2014. And then we have the Residential Infill Design Guidelines. I think those were adopted in 2018, I believe. I think that sounds right. So the Harrison District Design Guidelines are much more comprehensive. It's really our only comprehensive design guideline document for all kind of construction along Harrison Avenue. The residential infill design guidelines only apply to infill on vacant residential property. So it would not apply to commercial, would not apply to modifications of existing structures, including existing historic structures. So that's kind of the background of and the structure of historic preservation in Leadville, how we're operating today. So we have a set of proposed amendments, including your packet, that would essentially accomplish three important things. The first, and this is really the biggest item, although it wasn't kind of the item that was originally brought in front of the council. The first is that it would ensure that new commercial additions to historic structures, period, and exterior alterations to structures within the district, existing structures, would be reviewed for compliance with the design guidelines, either by staff or if the projects are big enough by the Historic Preservation Commission. So that's the first goal that these amendments would accomplish. The second is it would address what I'm going to refer to as the 6-month demolition loophole. It's in our code for demolition of historic buildings. And as the council members will recall, that's the original amendment that we approached you with. And then the third and final, and this is relatively minor, I believe, is that it would allow for staff site visits to projects that are subject to a pending certificate of appropriateness application. And to me, you'll hear me refer to this as a no-brainer because many other communities have this in their code already. All right, so I'd like to talk and explain a bit more about the first proposed amendment, which is including new construction additions, exterior alterations, or new commercial construction within the applicability section of the Historic Preservation Code. In your packet, I've included a map, and at this point, we have the capability of pulling that up right now. And Christian, if you have the packet pulled up,
Yeah,
this is,
I got it.
you got it, okay, all right, thank you. All right, so the map that's included in your packet essentially shows three boundaries. One being the yellow boundary for the city of Leadville, orange being the boundary of the National Historic District, and red being the boundary of the retail core. And so this is just to illustrate that in the retail core is currently the only area of town where you have essentially this comprehensive subjectivity for design guidelines. And I think this is on page 4, if you could, okay, thank you, pulling that up.
Page 3 on your packet.
Okay. Thanks. So outside of that red boundary, the only type of development that is currently subject to review by either staff or the Historic Preservation Commission for compliance with any kind of design standards would be a new residential home on a vacant lot. So if, for example, if you were going to go one block off of Harrison, you were going to propose a commercial office building, or if you were going to propose a 2,000 square foot addition on the back of a historic 800 square foot home, that would not be subject to the review of any design guidelines, whether reviewed administratively by staff or by the HPC. So that is a concern for staff and for the HPC. And I'm going to elaborate on that concern a bit. So I think we're an opportunity in Leadville, or we think we're an opportunity in Leadville where we have the opportunity to look ahead, be proactive and decide, okay, we understand what Leadville looks like right now. If we like it, and we want it to stay similar to that character, we have the opportunity to say, okay, we want to have certain controls to ensure that is what our town will continue to look like. I think everybody understands that Leadville is experiencing a rapid change in development character in certain parts of town, and I think that it's reasonable to believe that the market could potentially, we could potentially see more of that development coming in the next few years, the next 5 years, next decade, which currently could have a significant impact on the character of our town with our current design guidelines. So now we have the opportunity to be proactive and to really decide, do we want to have some controls in place so that we can have control over what our town will look like. I think there is a very important balance that we all want to strike between allowing developers, investors to come into town and do whatever they want in some of these areas that I've expressed concern about. And whether, it's demolish buildings, whether it's significantly alter historic buildings, whether it's add on to historic buildings, or build new commercial structures that are have extremely, modern appearance that are out of character. So there's a balance between allowing that kind of free will, or on the other end of the spectrum is, I think we don't want to overregulate. We do have concerns over affordability in this town already, and we can look at other cities who have overregulated and see that those towns are no longer affordable. And so I think we all understand that if we overregulate, that can affect affordability. And so I think we all want to strike a balance somewhere in there in terms of what Leadville, what we want Leadville to look like in the future. And we have that opportunity to discuss that now. I've included a case study on, I guess, page 4 of your memo that is an addition to an historic structure. This is at 218 East 9th Street, and I think there are other examples. This just happen to be the one that we probably had the best illustrations for. So I wanted to look at this as a case study. Do you have the capability to zoom in just a little bit? Thank you. So this is in addition to an existing historic structure. This is outside of the retail core. It was not on a vacant lot. So this was not subject to any kind of design guidelines. And my understanding, this has been constructed, correct?
Yeah, it's standing there.
Okay, and so I think that we can all look at this structure. I mean, we don't have an image of the historic facade of the historic structure here on the screen. But I think we can all agree that this, very modern, very boxy, square, flat roof structure is out of character with not only this historic structure, which is, typical. In this case, it's a gabled and a hip roof, single story, which is, the predominant character of a lot of our historic district. So it's not only out of compliance with the character of the existing structure, it's out of compliance with the character of the neighborhood and the district as a whole. And so this is just one example of something that just happened a year and a half ago. That kind of embodies the concern for this particular, for one of these concerns, which is additions. And we'll talk about exterior alterations and commercial also. So I think we can all agree this is the kind of development that we don't want to see repeated, but the concern is that could happen with our current code. And I don't have an image for this, but I included this case study in your memo. As I think most of you know, I came from Breckenridge. I worked there for 7 years, and there was a study that was done by the state of our historic district, and historians were brought in. The Breckenridge had a National Historic District, similar to the designation that Leadville has. It's actually a smaller district in that it doesn't include as many structures as Leadville has. As many contributing structures. Just under 20% of the structures received modifications or additions in the 90s and the early 2000s from the huge development rush that happened in Breckenridge at that time. The state came back and downgraded just under 20% of the district, which just turned into a big mess. It created a lot of chaos. There were, dozens and dozens of city council public meetings because there was this overall concern and there was this threat that if this development pattern continued, what was happening. A lot of this was additions to historic structures, just massive additions on the back of historic structures. There was this overall concern that the National Register Historic District was going to lose its designation, and it was just going to be another small town that had kind of gotten behind and had become overdeveloped. And that was not what Breckenridge wanted. Breckenridge is a completely different town with a completely different economy, as we all know. But I think this is a very relevant example because it happened just over the hill, and it's not unreasonable to think that. Obviously Leadville is completely different, but we are experiencing development and market pressures, and that those similar kind of impacts could happen here in Leadville. And I think that is a concern. Please stop me if you guys have any questions or comments at any point. So I kind of want to just do a quick little exercise just to kind of break this up a bit. And, if everyone could, just imagine your favorite historic residential street in Leadville. I've got an image here on my screen, on my laptop. I'm sorry, I can't share it with the folks on the Zoom screen, but, there were two streets that came to mind for me. One was 9th Street, just north of, the homes that are just north of the mining museum.
Chapin, this is Greg. Sorry to interrupt, but Dana Green has her hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chapin. I'm sorry to interrupt too, and I apologize for the hand clapping. That was a fumble finger. I am wondering if Breckenridge did lose their status.
No, so it was that they enacted emergency moratoriums and it was kind of all hands on deck to hold, open houses with the public. And I can't even remember the number of meetings, but there was like 30 or 40 meetings. It was ridiculous. So the answer is no, but it was chaos for about 2 years to try and adopt these emergency ordinances because there was so much development pressure that was happening. So the answer is no, but it took a lot of work.
Were they threatened with a loss of their status, or was this simply a concern that they were responding to urgently?
So officially, yeah. So officially, there were 21 of the original 118 structures that were officially downgraded by the state from contributing to non-contributing. So that, I think that's the technical answer. I don't know if there was a formal summary announcement that Dear Breckenridge, Colorado, the state of or Dear Breckenridge, the state of Colorado has determined you are in threat, you are under threat to lose your designation if you don't do something. But there was definitely informal communication from the state, and there was a lot of involvement from the state during this process.
Does the state have a minimum number of contributing buildings under which one would lose a status like that?
No, there's not a hardline number or percentage that I'm aware of, and that definitely, I think the answer is no. That never came up in those discussions.
Okay, so there was a lot of urgent discussions and a lot of action over a concern that was not clearly a threat of loss of status.
Yeah, and I don't know that there is a formal process from the state to to go through a hearing process that says that you are formally under threat of losing that. I think that they have their staff members to work with their jurisdictions to try and let them know when there are these concerns, but I don't know that there's really anything in between. I think you just get to the point where there's a formal process for losing your designation, but I don't know if I'm not aware of a formal process where the state comes in, issues some kind of formal declaration that you're under threat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Chicken, if I may, this may
Yeah.
be a good point for me this is one of the reasons why I thought it was really important to bring a planning director on board, is that, a lot of what we hear is people really like the character of Leadville. They want it to remain a mountain town. And what we are hearing about Breckenridge is they ended up having to be reactionary. And it took a lot of staff time, a lot of public meetings, a lot of heartache. And what we're trying to do is be more proactive. We are probably, my guess is 5 to 10 years maybe behind some of the other mountain towns as far as development, but we are not, it's not like it wouldn't be coming, and it's not like we shouldn't prepare. And what I've heard over and over is people want Leadville to remain a funky mountain town. We're one of the last remaining sort of funky mountain towns. And this is in large part due to its character, and the character of its buildings is a key to that. And so I think this is being proactive and looking at what we want to do to maintain the character of Leadville. And this has been a process that's been, HPC's worked on for a long time, Chapin's worked on for a long time. And I think it's a necessary step to be, instead of having, 30 public meetings and 2 years worth of stress and worry, that this is us being proactive.
I guess one of the reasons why I initially had worries is that I feel like the residents have expressed to me that there isn't enough support for them to preserve and continue preserving properties as historical, while also being affordable for them for those modifications. Like if they were to need to replace a window, they need to get a very specific type of window with very specific type of framing. et cetera, et cetera. So it seems like there isn't enough resources in my mind, and maybe addressing it would be the resources not necessarily being not implementing some type of loophole, because I don't personally have a strong tie to the historical nature of it, but clearly it's important to the community. So I don't mind, going along with that part, but it still seems like we need to have some type of resources for people who are, wanting to modify their homes, so that it is a little bit more energy efficient while still preserving the historical nature of it. That process seems to be very difficult, even for people who are experienced. And I've had people who have worked in this area for quite a while who are still not willing to go through it because it's strenuous and taxing to them financially mostly. And I think I don't mind it. And it seems like some of the other two modifications you have would honestly probably help get a good feel of, well, staff can now go out to see this structure and can provide these different funding routes in the future. But so I'm not against any of it. I'm just saying that we also should, prop them up for success and make sure that they have the proper resources to continue to make sure their homes are historically accurate if we're going to continue this process with residential areas, which is initially my issue, not downtown. I don't think anyone would want to see any of the downtown area to be heavily modified in any way. So that was kind of the big issue for me at that time. And it felt like a little bit too fast moving to say, yeah, let's just go for it without really implementing some type of structure behind it and some type of, hey, we know it's a little bit hard to maintain some of these issues, and just look at the Tabor. Here's some potential areas and avenues that we can help with funding, for example, so that we can continue preserving your house in that historical district.
All right.
And I think there's Chief, I want you to maybe identify and talk about significant versus insignificant and working with homeowners to figure out a cost-effective way to do modifications where we don't want someone to not be energy efficient. And I think that's where we can talk about significant versus insignificant and the administrative approval process, which will hopefully be a lot easier and a lot more streamlined. And we can perhaps even help identify source providers who might be more economical, Chapin's experience, and we can point them to people who could help them with more economical ways to upgrade their home. So that was what I just wanted maybe to talk about that part.
Sure. Yeah. So the intent of this is really, like I said, to find that balance between not allowing essentially people who are not a member of this community and are wanting to dump money into structures and for strictly for market purposes, and so try to find a balance between making sure we have some kind of control in place so that those folks can't do whatever they want, and then making sure that we, as best as possible, are facilitating the classic example of a family of four with two employees that work here in town, and maybe they're barely hanging on with their mortgage, and they have to replace the roof and they have to replace the windows to get some energy efficient upgrades, and making sure that they have someone that they can go talk to make sure that the things that are getting approved aren't causing some big issue, but we can very quickly and ideally right over the counter give them an administrative approval and guidance, and also the opportunity for further guidance, so they have a person to talk to, and that's why you've hired a planning director. So it really is trying to find that middle balance, and that's the intent of the proposed amendments.
Yeah, Chapin, thank you for that. That all feels great, but it also feels very theoretical in terms of Christian's concern. Christian's concern is a real world concern, which actually is in place. And I don't know if Joey would like the opportunity to talk about this, but I'll say that we had a visit about 2 weeks ago from OEdit and History Colorado, and they now have a person in History Colorado that all she does are tax credits for historic preservation. And I asked her specifically, you're talking about homes, right? She said yes. They certainly deal in buildings like the Tabor Opera House, but you know, they also are deeply concerned or invested in helping people get the tax credits to make these things possible. So, and I'd like to go a step further. You know, we've talked some about the National Historic Overlay District and how we might lose it. I think we're missing the point. Do I like that we have that designation? Yeah, that's great. But that's not the real point of what we're trying to do is to preserve Leadville in some sort of an historic context, so that it continues to be a great place to live. And I've said before, you know, we have some identities as a city, and one of them is recreation. That's a big deal. But the other one is history and the look of our town, and try to keep that from dissolving into modern society. So, you know, that's it for me.
Can I just add that I had a lot of the same concerns, and kind of what appeased those concerns for me would be found on page 10 of the package, where it discusses insubstantial modifications and substantial modifications. So if it's determined that it's an insubstantial modification, that would be determined by the planning director.
Right.
And then that COA would then be done over the counter,
Yes.
say with no charge. And that would just be an automatic approval by you.
And that's one of the things that this is a little bit off topic, but you know, we're planning to come to the council in a few weeks and also ask like, what kind of fees do you want to charge for this? Do you want it to be no charge? Do you want to have a small fee? So we're just capturing some of the administrative costs, those sorts of things. But so you'll have the opportunity to have some input on that also.
But yeah, common maintenance on older houses, the vast majority of that's gonna come back as insubstantial. Now, if somebody wants to change the windows across the front of a historic house, or if somebody wants to change the style of siding on the front of their house, then that gives us the opportunity to make recommendations to make it more in keeping with the neighborhood. But it certainly doesn't have to be anything that costs more. You don't, you know, you're not required to. Would it be great to be able to keep the same size and style of windows that you currently have? Yes, absolutely. Are we absolutely against people putting in energy efficient windows? Absolutely not. So it's common sense things, but it's common sense things that help keep the character of the neighborhoods. And it's just one more review before we come before you, or there being no review, and somebody coming in and doing something that, you know, in the house next door to yours that you didn't appreciate either. It's just another set of eyes to help keep the neighborhoods cohesive.
I do think it's important to talk about kind of the impacts in terms of what kind of permits, you know, folks are required to go get for what's proposed. So, you know, if someone's proposing, you know, like for like replacement of their roof, of their siding, of their windows, that is completely exempt from this, that nothing changes. If they're proposing to change those materials, if they're proposing to, you know, go from asphalt shingles to metal roofing, if they're proposing to, you know, install energy efficient double pane windows, if they have single pane windows, even like a non-historic structure, even a non-historic, non-compliant structure. If they're proposing to change the siding from, you know, wooden lap siding to you know, shiny reflective metal paneling or something. So that then requires them to come in front of staff and say, okay, is this substantial or insubstantial? If for some reason we find that it's impactful, like for example, if they're proposing, you know, highly reflective metal panel siding that would definitely change the character of the neighborhood or be impactful to others, and then at that point, staff can say, we believe this is substantial, and then it has the opportunity to go to Historic Preservation Commission. But I think that latter scenario, things like that are going to be unlikely, and just providing essentially, to use your word, the over the counter administrative permit option, checkpoint for some of those more concerning scenarios. All right. So I had a little bit more in this presentation. I'll move on unless there are any other questions at this point. Yeah, sure. So I was trying to break this up a little bit, make it a little different from the last presentation, the last work session. So just, just imagining, I'm just really trying to hit home here, right now, what the current code would allow. So if you were all to just imagine your favorite residential historic side street in Leadville. So the examples that come to mind for me, I've got on the screen, my laptop screen. Yeah, sure. Are a few homes that are just historic homes that are just north of the mining museum. My other favorite, I think, residential street that comes to mind would be 7th Street, where Zero Day Coffee is, and the historic homes that are in that row. So you all probably have your own examples, and so right now, any of those side streets, other than half a block off of Harrison, if a developer were to come in and buy a few of those homes, an investor were to come in and buy a few of those homes, and they were to propose something a little bit radical, they were to say, actually on this home, I want to take off this bay window and all this ornate detail. Sorry, Kristen, this is going to be for you, I think. I don't know if you guys can see this, but
You actually could put it towards
okay.
the screen.
Okay, and it doesn't really matter that much, because we all can think of our own, our own examples. Yeah, it's just too low. So just think of a few rows of historic homes that when you're driving through town, you're like, okay, this is why I live here. I like this character. Now imagine a few of those homes. The bay windows were completely removed, the porch was removed, and maybe it even changed use. It became an office, and you had full floor to ceiling glass windows. And instead of having vertically oriented windows on the upper story, all of those were removed, and you had horizontal glass windows. So just imagine significant changes in character to a few of the buildings that you really appreciate when you're kind of doing business or living in Leadville. And so with just that one specific example, I just want to point out that right there would be completely allowed under our current code. So if somebody wanted to come in and spend a couple $100,000 on a few of these structures, whether it was independently or collectively, and then even more concerning, if those things were to happen repeatedly throughout town in different areas, that could be a significant change to the character of our town, and it would impact you. And so I'm using a little bit more of a radical of example to make a point, but it's not that far fetched, because the persons who come into town, especially from out of town, and want to invest money in structures may have different ideas than we do. But right now we don't have those kind of checkpoints. So I just wanted to kind of use that imaginary example to try and kind of hit that point home a little bit further. Let me just check my notes here before I move on, make sure I didn't miss anything regarding this category. So right now we've talked about additions, and we've talked about exterior alterations to existing structures, whether they be historic structures or non-historic structures. So the other point here that we haven't talked about much that is important to note is commercial. So right now, if someone were to, if there's a vacant property outside of the downtown core, and they wanted to put in an office building, there's no control for any type of design. So it could be a completely modern structure with floor to ceiling glass windows, right next to a row of 1800s historic Victorian homes. There's not any kind of checkpoint for that right now. All right, I think I've kind of beat that point home, so I'm gonna move on to the 6-month demolition loophole. So right now in our code, if someone were to receive a denial from the city council for a proposed demolition of a historic building, after waiting 6 months, that applicant could reapply, and per code, they are required to automatically receive approval for their demolition. So this is concerning because this is essentially allowing automatic approval for demolition without any kind of justification for denial of the original application. So that, I think that could have a disastrous long-term effect if people were actually find out about this and it was actually be implemented and we didn't do anything about it. We could lose, just individual kind of these anonymous structures that I referred to earlier, which could just by themselves, that could be impactful. A lot of those are cultural resources that have a lot of history that we don't even know much about. We could also, there could also be more significant structures that although they don't have they're not one of our 60 historic designated structures. They could be, significant structures in and of themselves, iconic structures that we could lose. Too many structures are demolished. Of course, that long-term, and a lot of these are worst case scenarios examples that I'm providing, but that's my job to think long-term, that could have, an impact, on our district, and we could essentially lose our designation if that were to happen. So the point is that we have an opportunity to correct this. If we look at what our code does in other areas right now, we have Title 16 and Title 17, which are our subdivision regulations and our zoning regulations respectively. So that's essentially anything that comes in front of the council for any kind of land use approval. Right now, within those two titles of our code, there are 10 various approval processes. So that would, include things like subdivisions, zoning, land use, any kind of site plan review. Out of those 10 processes within our code, this demolition this automatic demolition allowance is the only section of code that allows an automatic demolition, an automatic approval process after denial. If we go outside of the city of Leadville and we look at other mountain communities within Colorado, which is kind of my area of expertise, what I'm most familiar with. I am not aware, I've never heard of any kind of automatic approval process after demolition. After denial. It's essentially unheard of. So the HPC's recommendation, staff's recommendation, the city attorney's recommendation is to amend this code so that an additional application after an initial denial will be subject to whatever code is in place at the time of reapplication. So what that means is if the city council denies something, I think it is a good idea to have an applicant wait for a period of time before they can reapply. Otherwise, they can reapply every day, and that just buries staff. Most municipalities have a standard 6-month timeline. An applicant has to wait after their initial denial so that they don't essentially bog down the review process. So this means that the city council could essentially re-review the same application under the same code 6 months later. Or if the city council finds that there is some issue with the current code, but they feel like they must issue the denial for the demolition application to essentially be compliant with the code, but they have an issue with the code, they can direct staff, the council could direct staff, city attorney to revise, to amend anything that within the code that they had an issue with. And then, 6 months is a sufficient period of time for that amendment to take place. And then the applicant can reapply after that, under that new code section. So point being that they're recommending that the applicant, when they reapply, be subject to whatever code is in place at the time of their reapplication. And the proposed amendment is regarding site visits. As I've mentioned, I think this is a no-brainer. The reason for this is it's not a good idea to have the Historic Preservation Commission all come to a site visit to view a structure. And a lot of these site visits for the Historic Preservation Commission are going to be more detailed than the Planning and Zoning Commission or the City Council when they're reviewing a development application. I can essentially provide a lot of that information from the right of way or from site plans or satellite images, those sorts of things. But the Historic Preservation Commission, when they're reviewing an application, things do get into a bit more detail. And so I need to provide a staff report to the HPC. and I need to go on site. But if we were to have the whole HPC come out there in advance of a public hearing, we would could potentially be violating public meeting laws if we don't publicly notice that time period where all of the HPC is gathering on one site, or even multiple members of the HPC. So it's pretty essential for staff to be able to go on to a property that's subject to a pending COA application and be able to take pictures, document things, and then report that to the HPC in the public hearing and a staff report. So most communities do this. This is essentially just a housekeeping item, but it is important. So it's part of this recommended package. So attached to your memo in your packet tonight are the proposed red lines. Happy to answer any questions about anything in detail of this. Where we mentioned this previously, but where we are at right now is, the next steps would be if the council were to provide direction to staff and say, okay, everything is good, we agree with everything. The next step would be that staff would work with the city attorney to draft an ordinance that is essentially amending the code consistent with the red lines that are in your packet. And we would proceed to a public hearing at Planning and Zoning Commission. The Title 17 code requires that any amendments to Title 17, which would include these amendments to the Historic Preservation Code, are required to first go to Planning and Zoning Commission for public hearing. And so the Planning and Zoning Commission would see these proposed amendments in both red line form, which are included in your packet, and in ordinance format. And then the next step after that would come to City Council twice. And unless there are any changes from Planning and Zoning Commission, that would just be brought to the council in ordinance format. I think the last thing that I want to point out is I did receive it's called a public comment letter from Commissioner Mudge with the county, which I forwarded to the council today. I just want to make sure that the council is aware that we did receive a public comment letter in regards to these proposed amendments, although this is not a public hearing. That's the only comment letter that I received. I am happy to answer any questions or respond to those individual comments if the council wants, but otherwise I'll just leave it there. Thanks for my relatively long-winded presentation.
Man.
Yes.
Hi, Chapin. I would like to comment on the site visit part of that. I think that was a compromise position to only have staff do the site visit, and that we would have to have the homeowners permission before we could make that site visit.
Yeah, written consent required, and we also wrote in there that the advisory member of the HPC, which essentially functions as a helper for staff, since staff is limited, all things considered, when it comes to a lot of HPC reviews. So the advisory member is not a voting member of the HPC, so they can the essential functions of the advisory member is to assist staff with review of COAs and to conduct pre-application meetings.
And if I may, one more thing, just so the council understands, these site visits would only be required for a substantial COA, and they only allow staff to provide us a complete picture. It's really easy for an applicant to provide only their side of the story. So they can take pictures, they can see what's actually going on, and then HPC can give city council a properly reviewed suggestion, a properly reviewed recommendation. Thank you.
I was trying to see if I could.
Bergman has his hand raised.
Hey, Tim, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chapin, and perhaps this is just for you and I to connect offline on. I'm just wondering what this means for the current Lake County Courthouse and that campus there. Which we don't have to discuss now, but I just want to throw it out there for consideration.
Okay, yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that. That one's I guess, unique. So let's definitely think about that. I think that's probably best to discuss offline because it doesn't, it's, not the majority of the type of applications we would see with these proposed amendments.
Yeah, but Tim makes a good point that was that courthouse built in the late 50s, Tim?
1955.
Okay, yeah.
So it's within the retail core, so it's not part of the, really nothing's changing with these proposed amendments for that structure. Because it's already within the retail core. These proposed amendments are only changing things that are outside of the retail core. There would be new commercial or alterations to any structures outside the resident or the retail core.
Well, it hasn't changed, but I think to Tim's point, what if they want to make a substantial modification to that building? Then what would be the challenges in doing that?
Well, just be subject to the current code, which require Historic Preservation Commission review for the design guidelines for Harrison Avenue, which do talk about modifications to legal non-conforming structures, and then ultimately city council review. And I think the one extra side note on that is that the HPC, the city council, recently amended the period of significance locally to 1970, but and then we are going through a process to update that period of significance nationally.
Well, I don't really have any concerns with the code itself, just really emphasizing the fact that, I guess Sarah Mudge's letter also kind of agrees with this, having some type of financiary help for these people who are in this district, especially to help with maintenance, to help keep these areas so that they don't get to a point where demolition is needed, is kind of essential for this to work. Otherwise, just.
Yeah, and a large part of HPC's job is to provide economic solutions. Materials go a long way toward that, of course. And also be able to provide a pathway to incentives, tax credits, other types of community funding that can be used for local residents. That's a big part of what we do.
So as long as that is properly funded through and widely available, which maybe it's just a knowledge issue with some of the folks who are currently in there. I personally don't see any issues with that. I just, for council primarily want to, say that we probably should invest more into helping maintain these homes if we are going to keep people who live in them to the standard of historically relevant, which just makes sense to me. Maybe citywide as well, not just a historical preservation area, because it was expensive before when my family went through it, and I can only imagine it's doubled since. So it's in my mind essential to preserve this community's feel, to also fund it adequately, not just write it in code.
If I could throw something in, this is obviously in the future, but there is actually a National Park Service grant. I can't remember the name of it now, but as a CLG, we get the grant from the state, I think it's from the Park Service, but we're the grant keeper, meaning anyone can come to us and we can give those grants out. That's going to take a couple of years to get to that, but I see that as another resource available we have resources available for commercial. I mean, there's grants available for some of these commercial buildings. There's not for an individual home. So the tax, the tax credits, and then this grant that I just looked into last week, and went, we need to figure out a way to do this, because that would be like a pool of money that we had, that people could come to us with their projects, that we could say, here's you a grant for, for that project, which would help fund that. So that's another thing that I just recently came across that I really am interested in finding out how we could be, the overseer of that grant money, because it's a sub grant. We would be the sub, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's something that's very interesting. I just found this out last week.
I have one comment on that, and then I'll open up to Dana to speak, but I think it's appropriate to mention at this time that there's a little bit of give and get in there with the state. And so one of the benefits of being a certified local government is you're eligible for programs like that. But in order to be eligible for that under the CLG designation, there's other things that we have to continuously be doing. And we are doing those things. And one of those is, for example, we're applying for the grant to go out and survey, significant portion of town was one of the phases of multiple phases of surveying these towns, which allows us to understand what our historic structures are, to understand what's contributing and non-contributing, and to ultimately come up with guidelines that are appropriate for that certain area of town. So we have to kind of keep moving forward with those things, but as long as we're showing that we're doing that work, which we are, and there's financial commitments that are involved with that, in addition to like being able to receive grants, but we're also eligible at the same time to administer some of those programs like Lori just mentioned. Councilmember Green, please go ahead.
Thank you. A couple of comments on the demolition thing is, one is under section B3, are we using the efforts of the owner to sell the structure to a new owner as a bar for good faith effort? And if not, is that necessary? Because it seems a little bit, I don't know, it seems a little ridiculous and a little offensive. So that's my first.
I'm not going to fall on my sword about that, but by any means. This of all the things that are in here, that's one of those things that I don't feel. I'm not going to fall on my sword about that. So if there's concern over that, I have no concern with amending that.
Thank you. My other comment or question is, I'm sorry, I was looking through this very quickly, and so I may not have done as the best detailed read as I could, but is there any place in our proposed demolition verbiage to allow for partial demolition, like having some of the criteria, preservation of all or part of a structure that is considered to be contributing? Since I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, I think the concern is even demolishing part of a contributing structure. That's absolutely reason for it to become non-contributing. It's probably less likely if that removal is on the rear. So for example, if you have a square historic structure and you're adding an addition onto the rear and you're connecting that with some kind of like connector hallway element, and you're only modifying a certain part, and that's kind of reversible. The state does give some factor in terms of reversibility. So that's probably like a situation where we don't have as much concern, but if on the front facade, side facades, if you're removing, demolishing a portion of a historic structure, that is a concern, because that reduces it to non-contributing most likely.
Chapin, Christiana has her hand raised. She may have a comment on that.
Yeah, Christiana, please.
Thanks. First, I wanted to clarify Dana's question about the partial or whole structure demolition. Dana, what is your, is there a concern behind your question? Are you looking to address, like make sure that these partial or whole demolitions are addressed, or are you concerned about partial demolitions? I guess I'm wondering about that.
I'm not particularly concerned about demolitions in general. I think I share some of the concerns about people coming into town and just wanting to build whatever, wherever. But that's a side conversation. I guess my concern more is in including allowing or making special cases for partial demolitions that do not affect the front or the presenting facade of a structure, as some of the allowable criteria for demolitions. I am just looking for some more padding to make this workable and palatable to and prioritizing homeowners, rather than falling in the name of being proactive. My concern is that people have put down these very restrictive rules and over potential concerns and over concerns that have not really been realized by even our example places that you, Chapin, I'm sorry, not Christiana, have held up as an example. Sorry that I know that was convoluted.
I don't know if it's the answer to your question, but I definitely want to just provide the distinction between, if you are removing part of a building and especially if you're, so if you're removing part of the building, but not all the building, wouldn't be considered a demolition. It would just be considered, modification, alteration of existing structures. So the code, the proposed amendments do contemplate that. And then of course, if you are modifying a portion of the building to add on to it, then that would be considered addition. But a demolition would be 100% removal of the existing structure. So we don't really have, the code doesn't really contemplate like a partial demolition.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. The definition of demolition is a demolition in whole or in part of a historic structure. So it does contemplate that in the definition. And Dana, to, I think, more directly answer your question about does the code or our proposed amendments address partial demolitions in the way that you're talking about, I don't think there's anything in the current proposed revisions that directly address that. But if you look at the demolition section of the code, I think this is page 17 of your packet, you can see that part of the demolition application and what an applicant has to demonstrate is that the demolition, to the greatest extent practical, demonstrates that any impacts that occur to the visual character of the neighborhood where demolition is proposed to occur are mitigated to the greatest extent possible. So that's, I think, as of right now, that's the thing that most directly addresses what you're talking about. But beyond that, there's nothing right now. And so if council would like us to explore ways to integrate additional criteria that address your concerns there, then we would be happy to bring back some proposed amendments, additional amendments to that effect.
Well, thank you, Christiana. I think that was kind of the fine verbiage that I was rapidly searching for and didn't find, but thank you for pointing that out.
Of course.
That makes a lot of sense to me, because maybe in code, there could be something that gives guidance to people about what might constitute a partial demolition that would not be considered in conflict with historic preservation, something like that.
Can I just throw out that we did have a partial demolition COA this past year on 114 3rd, I think, 112, and it was for the demolition of a mud room, and it came through the HPC as a demolition request, and it was granted because it was on the back side of the house. It didn't affect the facade or the front. It was considered a partial demolition, and the HPC did approve it, and then the owner withdrew it, so it never came before city council. But the point is that we do have occasional partial demolitions that come through, and that's exactly what we look at. Is it at the rear? Is it an impact to the front facade or front facing? And it was we did approve that before. That's just throwing that out there. We've processed the
thank-
partial.
Thank you, Lori. And I do definitely appreciate the current HPC's approach. It seems very, it seems very cognizant of the homeowners and their limitations. I guess what I'm looking for in code is to a code that doesn't always count on a good HPC. So
That's very true, very true. And understandable.
Yeah, so many of the historic houses in Leadville have been added onto at the rear of the house multiple times. It's not uncommon to see 3 or 4 or 5 as plumbing is added, as an extra bedroom is added. That's where I think, Dana, I think I'm understanding you. If somebody wanted to do an addition and remove one of those previous additions to enlarge the house or to modernize the house, yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And HPC wouldn't see anything wrong with that. The only thing we would want to do is review it in such a way that it doesn't change the character of the neighborhood or doesn't substantially change the character of the house. You see that all over town. They are a lot of times required additions or required upgrades. There's nothing wrong with that. It just gives us the opportunity to point somebody in the direction of making it a contributing factor instead of a non-contributing factor.
So
And
I
that-
guess a related question then is if, like Chapin said, there is other code that addresses the modifications, and our demolition code says complete or partial, are those two codes consistent with each other? That's more a question for Christiana.
Good question.
It is a good question.
I would have to look, Dana.
Sorry, I don't want to give you any more work.
That's okay.
Another part of that, like kind of just adding on to what Joey mentioned is, I definitely agree that there are structures in Leadville that have received multiple additions over the years. And when we get to, ideally, when we get to the point where we have cultural resource surveys for all of our district, and archaeologists have had an opportunity to go to a structure and to look at these things. They do, in these cultural resource surveys, they do make determinations as to when an addition to a structure has now gained significance. And in these cultural resource surveys that we are applying for grants for, we'll get into the level of detail to where it'll say, okay, there have been 2 additions onto this historic structure. The middle addition has gained significance over time. The exterior, the addition that's furthest to the rear has not. And so that provides some guidance to both staff and the HPC. When an applicant comes in, they say, okay, I want to remove 2/3 of this building or 1/3 of this building, but not the whole entire thing. That does provide some guidance to staff and the HPC and ultimately to council, because we can reference those cultural resource surveys and make those determinations on what's appropriate or what's not.
And then provide recommendation to city council.
These are really great conversations, and I'm pleased that we're on approximately the right wavelength, that we have some possible additions to code that might clarify what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. Anything else from city council? Tim, any thoughts?
I don't have anything further to add at this time.
Christian, how about you?
I guess what I would say is I think we have something that we can come to planning and zoning with, and then ultimately come to council with a first reading. That's acceptable to me.
Okay, thank you. Christian, how are you feeling about
Well, to Dana's point, I don't always think that the right people are going to be sitting in the right place. And I see code as a way to kind of give people that liberty of not having to worry about who's there and how picky they are. So if at all possible, having some type of code that leads to partial demolition or addition that doesn't influence is possible. So that, you know, nitpickiness nature of it doesn't necessarily have as great of influence as it could potentially. That would be greatly appreciated, though the way that it stands right now, I see nothing that I would move from.
I would say this, Christian, to your point, the good news in all of this is city council is always the backstop for any and all decisions, you know, regarding historic preservation. And so, of course, you could have, you know, an HPC and a city council, but that's, you know, not in tune with what our community needs or wants, but you never know. Let's just assume it's always going to be golden. Dana, any thoughts?
Oh, I think I've vented all the thoughts I am capable of right now.
No, those are great suggestions. Thank you. Anybody else have anything they'd like to comment on before we go home, or I go home, put a pillow over my head?
Thank you guys very much.
Really appreciate your time, guys, especially those of you who come twice. Mayor, any-
Well, thank you all very much. This was very productive as usual. And it is 7:20 and this city council work session is adjourned.
Thanks, y'all.